Viewers, welcome. This is, as it turns out, my 10th week of doing our Saturday afternoon chats and demos, and it's been lots of fun. Let me introduce myself. My name is Megan, also known as Mistress Christmas, and I have been in the BDSM lifestyle for about 27 years, and oh good, I can actually read comments for a change. Hello Patty and everybody else. So I guess first off, I have a cheat sheet here because I never know what I'm talking about. So first off, let me introduce Jay Weissman here sitting beside me. He is a friend, and this man has done tons of stuff in his life, and I think what I'll do is I'll just let him do his own introduction and have him tell you a little bit about his background. So take it away anytime you want.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jay Weissman, and I've been a member of the San Francisco Bay Area BDSM community for a little over 40 years now. I attended my first S&M event. We didn't call it BDSM in those days. In 1975.
What did you call it?
Basically SM or kinky sex or something like that, but usually S&M. BDSM is actually a cyber era term. But let's see, I've founded 2 BDSM clubs and been a charter member of a third. I'm probably best known nationally, and if I may say so internationally, as the author of the book SM 101, A Realistic Introduction, which I believe is the #1 best-selling BDSM educational book ever written. I'm also the author of what my publisher insisted on calling Jay Weissman's Erotic Bondage Handbook, which is a very good beginning to intermediate level book in that particular discipline. That may also be the #1 best-selling book on rope bondage ever written. I have to check with my publisher on that, but it's certainly way up there. And I recently met Megan here, and it's been a genuine pleasure to get to know you. And I'm delighted to be here today to tell you a few things that are on my mind and to answer your questions.
Cool. So to be perfectly honest, I met Jay like 1990, about a year before your book, but he completely forgot who I was until we recently rejoined at a munch, and I reintroduced myself, so I thought it was really rather funny. You want to tell us a bit about, you have like a really varied background. I mean, you did the ambulance thing and
yes.
Med school, and tell us a bit about what you did before you got to SM 101.
Well, I suppose one could say that I have problems holding a regular job. I've done so many things.
I see. So that's the actual answer then.
Yeah, the awful truth comes out. The awful truth comes out. Well, let's see. Yes, I do have a very substantial background in medicine and in emergency medicine per se. The very first formal medical thing I ever did in my life, I was a demonstration medic at Richard Nixon's inauguration in 1969.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Now that's a long way back. What is a demonstration medic?
Well, you've probably all seen demonstrators, and sometimes they come into conflict with the police. And
that kind of demonstration medic.
Yes,
I see. Okay.
And sometimes the demonstrators get hurt. And there was actually a song that was very popular in that era. It was the song Sky Pilot by Eric Bergman and the Animals. And there was a line in there about Well, sky pilot is a slang term for a military chaplain. And there was a line in the song about, the soldiers go off to fight, but the saying is, but he'll stay behind and he'll meditate, but it won't stop the bleeding or ease the hate. And while I wasn't sure I could do anything to ease the hate, I did have a certain minimal level of first aid training. I said, well, maybe I can do something about stopping the bleeding. And so I went out and I was a medic at that demonstration, and I took care of a number of demonstrators that had been injured by the police. And I went on to be a medic in dozens of rallies and riots and demonstrations. This was during the time of the Vietnam War, which was, of course, a very political subject.
A huge disaster.
And there were a lot of people in the streets expressing their feelings about that.
Yeah. So you did that here in San Francisco?
In the Bay Area.
Right.
The Bay Area. And at a number of events. Among other things, I worked as a first aid medic at the infamous Altamont rock concert in December of 1969.
Oh, God, that's the Stones concert?
Yes, the Stones concert.
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
I was at that.
Oh, wow. Well, I knew some of the Hells Angels that were there.
Did you? Okay. Oh, I thought I recognized you. Okay.
Oh, dear.
Moonchild, how you been?
No, dates us, doesn't it?
But I went on from there to start. I was a Haight-Ashbury hippie at the time.
Everybody was a hippie at the time.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's true. And I started a very informal group called the Haight Emergency Medical Patrol. And yes, that does anagram to HEMP. And
figures.
And we used to walk up and down Haight Street with first aid kits. And we used to run into things, overdoses and things like that, people who had been beaten up. A lot of people thought it was a good idea to walk around barefoot on Haight Street, which usually lasted about a day before they decided that walking around on Urban Street barefoot was not a particularly smart thing. But I dug a lot of foreign bodies out of the soles of people's feet in those days. And I went on. I eventually became a first aid instructor for the American Red Cross, and went on to be in the very first EMT program in Sonoma County in 1972. And in the spring of 1973, I got my first job with an ambulance service.
So how long did you do the whole EMT thing for, and what kinds of crazy stuff happened?
Oh my, I was a working member of an ambulance crew for about 8 years. I started off in Sonoma County. I'm sorry, I started off in Marin County, and then I was up in Sonoma County for a while. I was briefly in San Mateo and Hayward, and then I was up in Oakland for 3 to 4 years. Oakland is a notoriously violent city, and I responded to...
It's always been really violent in Oakland.
Yes. Oakland is a serious hood.
Especially the old Black Panther days.
Yes, back and then West Oakland was a fairly notorious neighborhood.
Yep.
And West Oakland was part of my zone, a part of the area that I responded to calls to for quite some time. And then East Oakland was also part of my zone. And I can't even remember how many calls I did. Certainly thousands of ambulance calls. I estimate that I've done something like 300 cardiopulmonary resuscitations on actual people, and I've taken care of many people who've been shot, many people who've been stabbed, many people who've been beaten, cases of rape and child abuse so bad they needed an ambulance,
Right.
stuff like that. And I've got several back injuries now, plus I'm getting a few old, plus I'm an official senior citizen now, so I really shouldn't be running around on a truck anymore. But
An official senior citizen. I like
yeah,
that.
on Social Security and everything.
Yeah, exactly.
But I am the unofficially official first aid and CPR instructor for the Bay Area S&M community.
Yep.
I've taught.
And you still teach classes.
I do. I taught one just last month, actually.
There you go. That was the one in Portland?
No, that one was actually down in San Jose at a new play space there called the South Bay Spot, which is an excellent place. And if you're in the Bay Area, I strongly suggest you check it out. The president, Uncle Abdul, has been a friend of mine since the mid-1980s, and they've created a wonderful play space there where they hold parties and classes and socials and other things like that. But I really like teaching first aid CPR classes to kinky people. My tagline when I advertise the classes is because the average instructor does not know at what point to remove the ball gag.
Yes. and I've repeated it many times.
Yeah. And I know this to be true because I was an instructor trainer for a while, and yeah, they don't go over that in the official class.
I wonder why. So then you did like medical school for a while?
I did. I attended one of the schools in the Caribbean, like the one on Grenada. And
was it just for cost reasons that you went?
Yeah, well, no American medical school wanted a 32-year-old ambulance crewman with a 2.5 GPA and a number of field commendations. And there's actually a great deal of controversy about whether or not the number of first-year spots in American MD medical schools is kept artificially low or not. A lot of people are of the opinion that they actually intentionally keep their classes small.
Right.
And for this reason, a number of doctor of osteopathy schools have opened in the United States, and a number of medical schools have appeared in Mexico and in the Caribbean islands to catch the overflow for people who couldn't get into an American medical school. And everybody, many people have heard of St. George's Medical School on Grenada. I went to Spartan Health Sciences University, which was on St. Lucia.
Right.
I was lucky, actually. They were actually building the campus on St. Lucia when I got accepted, so I got to be in the very last class that did its basic science training in the United States. I was actually down in El Paso, Texas for a while, taking my lower division classes there, anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, stuff like that.
Right.
And
so how long did the medical school thing last before you moved on to?
Well, I was in my third year, and I just plain and simply ran out of money. It was
That's really sad.
It was a very bitter pill. It really was. I was in the top third of my class. I had actually already passed the internship qualifying exam. But the powers that be at the time had made sure that Americans studying medicine abroad couldn't get student loans, and my well-off but highly dysfunctional family refused to help me.
Right.
And so basically that was that. I really ran out of choices and had to stop.
So is that when you decided to start writing, or is that when you decided to do the lawyer thing?
Well, I started writing my first book when I was about 20. And I kept having ideas for various books. But school and being going to undergraduate school, I have a bachelor's in science with an emphasis in physiology.
Right.
But in 1985, when I ran out of money, I was increasingly frustrated actually being in medicine and running around doing calls or going from patient to patient in the hospitals, treating one patient at a time. I was thinking, if I was writing about this, I could write something that could be read by thousands of people, quite honestly, even more.
Right.
I actually sold an article to an EMT journal back in 1981, which was the first time I ever got paid to write something.
And what was the article about?
It was an article about a mnemonic to help you remember how to take a history from a patient.
Oh.
And somewhere in storage in my apartment, I have a photocopy of the first check I ever got. And it was kind of like feeding a stray cat, And so in 1985, I said to myself, well, you always said you wanted to be a writer someday. I guess someday is here.
Right. So is that like, would you start doing like research to write the book, or?
Well, I knew I wanted to be a writer, and at the time, every Tuesday night at the main branch of the San Francisco Library, the San Francisco Writers Workshop was meeting, and it was the oldest free and ongoing writers workshop in America. And so I started schooling myself to be a writer with much the same discipline that I had schooled myself to be a doctor. I was reading books on writing and going to writers' workshops and so forth, and started writing various small pieces. And after all, actually, a friend of mine asked me to write an article about meeting people through personal ads because I had been doing that for a while. So I began to write the article. He wanted a 3,000-word article, and I kept writing, and I kept writing, and I kept writing. And eventually it grew into a small book of about 20,000 words, which I called Personal Adventures, How to Meet People Through Personal Ads. And that was my very first book, published by a small press in San Francisco in 1989.
Oh, is that book still like available that you could actually purchase it, or?
No, not for some time.
No.
From there on, I was already starting to work on SM 101 at the time because there really was no comprehensive introductory book about how to do BDSM.
Right.
There had been some good books. Patrick Califia was the editor of the Lesbian SM Safety Manual, and Larry Townsend had written the book Leathermaster, which was about 50% gay male porn and about 50% BDSM how-to.
Right. That name sounds familiar.
Yes, Larry Townsend did some really excellent work. But as far as I can tell, I am the first heterosexual person who wrote about BDSM not from the standpoint of a researcher or like from the standpoint of a fiction author. For example, Anne Rice wrote the Beauty series, but she's always been very emphatic that she doesn't do BDSM. She merely fantasizes about it. And the other people who had actually written about it from a practitioner's point of view were up to that point gay or lesbian. So I believe I am the first heterosexual person ever to step forth and write about BDSM from the point of view of somebody who actually did it.
Well, that's pretty cool. So, like, what kind of problems did you run into doing the book?
Well, I suppose the main problem that I ran into was S&M was a lot more taboo in those days than it is now.
Right.
People lost custody, and at the time, the American Psychiatric Association Diagnostic and Statistical Manual was stating that all S&M behavior, and they specifically included all consensual SM behavior.
Yeah, we were crazy back then.
The powers that be decided that that was in and of itself proof of a mental illness.
Right, exactly.
And that what we needed was therapy. So people lost jobs, people lost custody of their kids, and so forth. And actually, one of the reasons that I felt I could write SM 101 under my legal name was thinking, okay, I'm self-employed, so I can't get fired.
Yeah.
My kids don't live with me.
Yeah.
I don't hold any security clearances. I don't have any professional licenses that could be revoked. What can they do to me other than wag their finger at me and then say what a bad person you are? And as the people in the gay and lesbian community discovered, the more people who come out, the easier it is for subsequent people to come out. And so very shortly after I published, I went on to self-publish the remainder of my books. I learned a lot about book marketing and distribution with my first book.
Was it hard to find a publisher for SM 101?
I didn't really look. At the San Francisco Writers Workshop, I heard many horror stories of really talented authors who were trapped into really bad contracts by New York publishing companies.
Uh-huh.
And so I knew that an offer to publish a book from a New York publishing company did not necessarily mean that your ship had come in. And I actually turned down an offer from a New York publishing company to publish SM 101. I actually felt at that point that I could do as well on my own. It may have been the smartest business decision I ever made.
Yeah.
And it's what led to the company that's now known as Greenery Press, which is the far and away the leading publisher of alternative sexuality how-to books. So yes, I kind of got published by starting my own publishing company, and I'll leave it up to the viewers to decide whether or not that was cheating.
Well, I don't know. It seems to have served you well because you're still writing and you're still you're making a living, and
I basically.
What more could you ask for? You're doing what you love to do, right?
Pretty much, yeah. Let me knock on wood as I say that. But yes, I've been supporting myself. Not luxuriously, but adequately,
right.
On my earnings as an author, pretty much since 1990.
So, maybe you could tell us a bit about like your involvement in the BDSM community, like the early maybe stuff, and then what you're doing now. I know that you were the founder of, was it Genesis?
Gemini.
Gemini.
Well, I attended my first ever BDSM event. If memory serves, it was in July of 1975. There was an organization called Backdrop, which was in Hayward, California at the time. And Backdrop, they did pro-dom and pro-sub sessions during the day. And at nights and on weekends, they would have classes and parties and socials and things like that.
Right.
And I went to my first event there in 1975. It was a master-slave auction.
God, that's so long ago. I can't even imagine.
And I remember fairly clearly there were 31 people sitting around in a rough circle in the living room. And this was my first ever kink event. And I was convinced that 98% of the people into BDSM were going to be dominant. I mean, because what sort of pathetic wretch would want to be submissive?
Oh, that's right? The best part.
And so at one point, Robin Roberts, who was, as it were, the master of ceremonies, he came out into the living room and he said, okay, well, all of you who are submissive, please come with me. And I was waiting for like maybe one or two people to stand up. And I suppose the word that can best describe what happened next is the word stampede. Because
you were like the only dom left then, right?
As I recall, when the smoke cleared, of the 31 people who were sitting there before Robin asked that question, 3 of us were sitting there afterwards, and this huge crowd of people went into the other room to come up and to wait their turn to be bid upon.
Well, there you go. It's always better to receive than give.
I suppose. I really didn't have a plan for what to do at that point. I think my jaw was still on the floor.
That's funny.
Like there's this one guy who was this really big, very ferocious looking man. And I took one look at him and I said, well, of course, he's a dominant, right? Nope. Nope. He got up with all the rest of them and walked into the room. And I suppose the question was, is he dominant or submissive? I looked at him and said, he's anything he wants to be.
So what happened to this organization? I assume it's not around anymore, obviously, but...
I don't think Backdrop is holding events at the time. It's moved around to various locations in the Bay Area. They've been in Oakland, they've been in Richmond, they've been in San Mateo, and a few other things. But I believe Robin has moved on to other things now, so I don't think Backdrop is functioning at this point.
And Gemini?
Gemini. Well, one of the things that was true about doing S&M in the 70s, and remember, this was a lot more taboo then. I've sometimes said to people, if you want to get an idea for how taboo SM was back in the 70s, imagine that currently you were of a belief that sex between blood relatives was okay as long as everyone was over the age of 18.
Okay.
And you would probably be very, very careful
Yes.
about who you shared that belief with.
Yes, I'm sure.
And if you were a member of a group that believed that, you would probably be very, very careful about about what sharing information with
Sure.
that. And that, back in the 70s, was about as taboo as, say, intra-family sex would be today.
So how did you all find each other?
I
mean, we didn't have the internet back then, so...
What we had back then was the Berkeley Barb.
Oh, God, I remember that.
Yes, an alternative news weekly.
Yeah.
And I remember I started having kinky fantasies.
Actually, I owned the berkeleybarb.com domain.
Did you?
Yes, I went and got it.
All right. All right. Bit of history there.
Yes.
Anyway, I started having kinky fantasies in about 1970, and I finally found a woman willing to let me tie her up in about 1971. The first 3 or 4 women I asked if they would let me tie them up during sex, they all basically said, "Oh, hell no." And many of them, they never looked at me quite the same way.
Maybe you should have started with a spanking.
Possibly,
Yes.
but it was sort of like they had this look on their face, like, how could you even ask me a question like that? It was a question that was the beginning of the end of a couple of relationships that I had. And then finally in 1971, I asked this one woman if I could tie her up during sex. And she looked at me for a second and she said, okay. I had no plan for this contingency. I mean, I knew what to do if I was turned down.
Did you bring rope?
I had some rope, yes. I remember going into a hardware store and buying some rope for the express purpose of tying somebody up with it. How exactly I was going to tie somebody up, I had only the most vague of notions.
Sure.
And I felt like a total pervert for bringing the rope up to the cashier. And this very bored-looking cashier, I was seriously afraid he would refuse to sell me the rope.
Well, how would the cashier know anything about what you're going to do with the rope?
I figured he must know somehow. There must have been some vibes about. But he sold me the rope, and I remember thinking, well, what kind of moral deviant is he that he would sell me rope, knowing I was going to use it to at least try to tie somebody up with. But he did. Yeah. So I took out the rope and I asked this one lady if she would let me tie her up, and she said, okay. And I really didn't know what to do. It reminds me of a few years earlier when I lost my virginity. I was so used to hearing no from a girl at some point. A girl would say, okay, you can go this far, but no farther. And then one night, this possibility dawned on me that she might not say no at all. And I suppose physically I knew what to do if she said yes, but
just not prepared.
Not emotionally prepared at all. And Susanna, wherever you are, thank you so much for being kind to that terrified young man.
That's so funny.
But I asked this woman if I could tie her up, and she said yes. And so I did my fumbling best to tie her up, and we had sex with her tied up. And the next morning, she was looking at me with this kind of smirk on her face. And the woman I dated after, and because I was convinced no sane woman is going to permit herself to be tied up during sex.
Right.
I was going to have to settle for women who were seriously damaged goods to permit me to tie them up during sex. But the woman after that let me tie her up, and the woman after that actually told me she really liked it. And at one point, and there's actually a quote about this in SM 101. She said, "It's been 3 weeks since you tied me up. Is something wrong?"
Very good.
And so I remember thinking, I'm going to have to adjust my perspective about this. Either there are an awful lot more damaged women out there than I thought, who don't seem particularly damaged as I deal with them, or maybe my point of view is inaccurate.
Yeah, a little inaccurate at the time. Yeah, exactly. So Jim and I went on for a little while, and then I guess you left it for some reason. And
well, what was going on back in those days is that submissive men didn't want to act submissive in the presence of dominant men.
Uh-huh.
And so at parties where there were dominant and submissive men and women, the dominant men and submissive women ended up in one part of the party space, and the dominant women, submissive men tended to end up in another part of the party space. And eventually we got the idea to form clubs on this. I started a male-dominant, female-submissive club called the Gemini Society, and my friend Bill Burns, I had met him at Backdrop, he started a femdom organization called the Service of Mankind Church, which is actually in existence to this day.
Oh, wow.
It's an actual religious nonprofit organization, tax exempt. In fact, they had a holiday open house a few weeks ago that I went to. Bill and his wife Robin are two of my oldest and best friends in the Bay Area BDSM scene.
Yeah. It's amazing that people, because I just started going to the Munches again in the last few months, and I'm meeting all these people that I met like 20, 25 years ago, and they're still in the scene. It's like, it's a never-ending kind of, once you're in, people don't seem to leave. And they continue to keep going to events, and it's very cool. I really love this aspect that people hang in there, and
Now you can't get rid of some of
you
us.
can't get rid of Jay.
They've tried, believe me, they've tried.
That's great. Let's see here. Let's change subjects a bit. Actually, we had a little bit of a discussion at lunch the other. I don't know, it was a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about goals and outcomes rather than the whole negotiation thing. I thought it was fascinating that the whole idea of talking about what you want as an outcome rather than defining a list of what you can or can't do is a better way to play.
Well, much as I hate this cliche, I had something of a paradigm shift about the way I think about BDSM and the way that I do BDSM some years ago. I decided, in sort of looking down on it from above, I decided that the lowest common denominator of what we wanted from our play is a good outcome.
Exactly. That's really the bottom line, isn't it?
One could certainly make that case.
Yeah.
And so there's good outcomes and bad outcomes. And I've got this reputation on the internet for being kind of safety obsessed. And obviously safety is important, but I think it's off the mark in a subtle but important way. I'm a student of outcomes. I study what produces good outcomes. I study what produces bad outcomes. And I came up with the concept of the minimally acceptable outcome.
Right.
And I decided that the minimally acceptable outcome was 3 days after the scene is over, everybody with what the legal types would call an interest in the scene feels basically okay about what happened. The participants feel basically okay about it. If they're not in a monogamous relationship, their partners feel basically okay about it. If it happened in a play space, place-based management feels basically okay about it.
Right.
It's all good. Because I think those of us who have been doing BDSM for a while, probably most, if not all of us, have had scenes where maybe the next day there was some physical or emotional issue that needed to be addressed, but you address that and hopefully it gets resolved and life goes on.
Exactly.
So yeah, I call it the 3-day test. 3 days after the scene is over, does everybody with a reason to care about what happened feel basically okay about it? And I found it to be a very good metric.
Yeah, it is. It's actually, I think it's a great concept, and I think people should play to that standard more than we do, because I've always been a little bit of a odd for the whole negotiation process to me. I mean, a lot of people have their lists and their questionnaires, but it's so hard to cover everything. It's so hard to remember everything. And
can I speak to that?
Yes, please.
In the late 80s, I figured out that everything that happens in a BDSM scene falls into one of 16 identifiable categories.
Only 16?
16 categories. And I made a list of these categories. It's in SM 101.
Yes.
And I actually created a mnemonic to help people remember the categories. And since the late 1980s, I have always passed the 3-day test when I got clear agreement on all 16 points prior to playing. I've had a success rate of 100% times with many, many partners times more than a quarter of a century.
Yeah.
And so while there's not one true way to negotiate, in my opinion, I'm getting at least a B+.
Well, there you go. Well, it sounds like you're trying to cover as much ground as you can in a concise way.
Yes, and as I said, I've had nothing but good outcomes when I've gotten agreement on these 16 points prior to playing.
Right. I don't know. I guess I'm just not a person for lists.
Well, when I teach my negotiation as foreplay class, I tell my audience that using this checklist helps male dominance comply with the prime directive of being a male dominant.
Which is?
Stay out of trouble.
Okay.
And I have avoided a great deal of trouble by using this checklist.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of male doms out there that deserve to be in trouble. Though,
No argument on that.
I, in fact, was speaking with a sub the other day who has had 2 recent bad experiences.
No.
And from doms that were either improperly trained or lacked a skill set in which to properly apply their trade.
Well,
And I think it happens too often.
Yeah, in talking about the 3-day test, my experience is that, particularly with a new partner, the number one predictor of whether you will pass or fail the 3-day test is the quality or lack thereof of pre-play negotiation.
Yeah, I agree. Oh, I love to talk, and I love to know the people that I'm going to play with long before I actually ever play with them. In fact, most of the time I have a sub or I will play with another dom, it's because I've known that person for a long time, and which sort of helps quite a bit for when you actually get down to playing. So.
I agree. Things like asking for references have their role. Negotiation has its role.
Right.
Setting up a silent alarm, or what's called a safe call, has its role. But in my opinion, nothing keeps you safer than simply taking your time to get to know the other person.
Yes, exactly. It really does. It makes a huge difference.
It really does.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the alarm issue and having people check in, especially with when you're playing for the first time, is so important. And when I did pro work, I always had somebody that would call me.
Okay.
So because it's just like you don't know who you're working on. So
well, the most important thing, in my opinion, about a silent alarm or a safe call is that your potential partner knows it's in place. I mean, it's a basic teaching of criminology that if you want to deter bad behavior,
right,
you don't do it by increasing the penalty for being caught.
Sure.
You do it by increasing the probability of being caught.
Exactly.
Like when I lived in Mexico for a while, the banks have lots of money on the 1st and 15th of the month.
Right.
And back when I was living in Mexico, it was a common practice for each bank to have a squad of soldiers in it on the 1st and 15th of the month. So you've got, 10 guys with automatic weapons hanging around the bank, and you can guess how many bank robberies take place in Mexico on the 1st and 15th of the month.
Right. Exactly. Well, speaking of law, let's bounce over to your sometimes position of expert witness that you do.
Yes.
Tell us about this. This is so fascinating, and I know that you got a wonderful opinion about the asphyxiation kinds of play. So please go for this, because this is I love this.
Okay. Well, as they taught me to say on the witness stand, as I sit here today, I am a multi-state court-qualified expert witness on BDSM in general and on breath control play in particular. I've done expert witness work for about 15 years now. I've been an expert witness in several homicide cases. I'm actually retained in a homicide case right now where breath play is at issue.
Right.
And I'm doing expert witness work in a growing number of questionable consent cases. There's two types of witnesses in a legal proceeding. There are what are called lay witnesses and expert witness. And a lay witness is your classic witness. They saw something or they heard something.
Sure.
And they can testify about what they saw, what they heard, what they smelled, etc. But they're not allowed to express an opinion beyond a matter of everyday knowledge. Like like a lay witness could say, well, that car was going really fast, or that person
Sure.
was acting drunk, or something like that. But let's say that somebody buys a toaster and they take the toaster home and they go to make some toast and they get their hands seriously burned due to an electrical short in the toaster.
Right.
And so they sue the manufacturer of the toaster on a product liability claim, alleging that the toaster was improperly designed or improperly manufactured. Well, I don't know whether or not that toaster was properly designed or manufactured. You don't know whether a toaster was properly designed or manufactured. So they would basically find somebody with like a PhD in toasterology or something like that, who would come into court and testify on the stand as to whether or not the toaster was properly designed or manufactured. And there's expert witnesses on all sorts of things, on plane crashes, on firearms, restaurant management. There was a man named Dan Pointer who was an avid skydiving enthusiast, and he did expert witness work in skydiving mishaps. So basically, an expert witness is allowed to express an opinion to the jury on something that is outside the scope of knowledge of the average person. In a lot of, like for example, if the defendant pleads not guilty by reason of insanity, both sides will bring in psychologists and psychiatrists to testify as to whether or not the defendant was sane, either at the time they did the act or now during the trial.
Right.
Like, for example, there's a rule that you can't try a defendant if they're insane.
Sure.
Because they can't assist in their own defense. So what happens is you keep the defendant in custody, assuming it's a no bail case. You keep the defendant in custody until they're sane enough to stand trial.
Sure. So, like, what happens in these, like, BDSM cases? Is it just naturally assumed that the guy killed his wife because of an accident from breath play? Or do they actually buy into the whole, this was actually something that they were doing consensually? Or what happens in this kind of cases?
Well, As I said, due to my emergency medical service background and due to my time in medical school, I have a pretty extensive education in anatomy, physiology, pathology, and so forth.
Right.
And I remember back in about 1994 on the internet news group Alt-Sex Bondage, a guy
God, I remember that.
Yes, good old ASB.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, Usenet. My God,
Usenet.
that's like ancient history here.
The glory days.
Yes.
But a
It's
guy,
good to be old.
but a guy was talking about what happened when he strangled his submissive, and I remember reading his post and thinking, that's wrong. That's just factually incorrect.
Right.
I mean, this is known physiology. Okay, we know what happens to a body when it's strangled or suffocated. It's not a mystery, and he was rather misinformed about what was going on.
So what does happen?
Oh boy.
Was this a bad question?
Well, there are three basic ways a person can die from being strangled.
Okay.
They can die from having their windpipe compressed, so they can't get air in or out, and they would suffocate from that reason.
That makes sense.
Or they can die from having the carotid arteries in their... Now, that would take several minutes to die because your windpipe was compressed.
Crushed, yeah.
Or they can die from having the carotid arteries in their neck squeezed shut, thus shutting off blood to their brain.
Right.
And again, it would take them several minutes to die from that. Or they can die from having some nerve bundles in their neck called the carotid sinus bodies stimulated.
Uh-huh.
And if the carotid sinus bodies are strongly stimulated, one of the things it does is it dilates the arteries up in the brain, so there's not enough blood to perfuse the brain and the person loses consciousness. However, stimulation of the carotid sinus bodies in the neck also sends a message to the heart via what's called the vagus nerve.
Yes.
To decrease the rate and force of cardiac contraction.
Right.
And every now and then, strong vagus nerve stimulation of the heart causes a cardiac arrest. Like there are many triggers for this. You may have heard of someone who had a heart attack and died from sitting in the toilet. That would be a vagus nerve-induced cardiac arrest. There are people who fall into very cold water, and you fish them out of the water in a minute or two, but they're at cardiac arrest. That would be a vagus nerve-stimulated cardiac arrest. But every now and then, somebody suffers a vagus nerve-caused cardiac arrest from only a few seconds of strangulation or suffocation.
Uh-huh.
And that's important legally because if you had to maintain a chokehold for several minutes to compress their windpipe or their carotid arteries, that's a very strong argument that you intended to kill this person.
Yes.
Whereas if a cardiac arrest can be caused by only a few seconds worth of stimulation of the carotid sinus bodies, that raises an argument of perhaps this was an unintentional death.
Right.
Therefore, some form of manslaughter. And of course, if you're convicted of manslaughter, your probability of getting parole eventually is much higher than if you're convicted of murder.
That would be true. So have you seen cases go both ways where they're guilty versus not guilty?
I've only heard, and I haven't been able to, well, most of these defendants are found guilty of one degree or another of criminal homicide. Homicide is the killing of one human being by another human being.
Right. I mean, just the act, she's dead or he's dead, therefore it's a crime regardless.
Yeah, so I've only heard, and I haven't been able to verify this case, but I've only heard of one case that resulted in an outright acquittal of the defendant after he used a chokehold on his girlfriend during sex and she died.
Oh, wow.
And as I said, I haven't been able to verify that case. And so the cases that I work in, the breath play homicides, it's largely a debate over whether this was an intentional or unintentional killing.
Right.
And it can be very difficult to ascertain that because the behavior in both cases can be identical. As I said in one breath play homicide I worked on a few years ago, it's not like he shot her 9 times.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's like, yeah, I don't know how you would prove that at all.
It's murky. It really
murky.
is. I actually have times when I participate in these murder trials, I'm actually glad that I'm only the expert witness. You know, I get on the witness stand. I say what I have to say, and I go home. It's the jurors who have to make the decision.
Yeah, they got to figure out whether or not they really think it happened or didn't happen.
Yes, and my heart absolutely. I would not want to be a juror in one of these cases. That would be a very, very difficult decision to make.
Right. So overall, breath play, I mean, what do you think? Is this like a really stupid thing to do, or is this like something that can be safely done?
I don't think it's possible to do any significant form of breath play without some risk of a sudden cardiac arrest. As I said, in some cases, only a few seconds of suffocation or strangulation can cause a cardiac arrest.
Sure.
So it's kind of a Russian roulette model of risk.
Yeah, that's doesn't sound good.
And a lot of the things that people think are making them safer, in my opinion, aren't really making them safer. Like they say, well, I'll learn CPR, and
You know, that's not going to help too much in some cases.
Well, I mean, I like the fact that people know CPR. I became a CPR instructor,
right?
in large part because I got tired of arriving at emergency scenes, cardiac arrest scenes, and seeing no CPR in progress. And if no CPR has been done before the first person wearing a uniform shows up on the scene, it's basically game over.
Yeah.
That outcome is decided before the first person wearing a uniform appears.
Sure.
But I cannot be of the opinion that knowing CPR makes breath play significantly safer.
Right.
Or if people say, well, I always stop before they pass out. Well, you never really know when somebody's going to pass out
Yeah.
until they do. And when they pass out, in that moment, you can't really know why they passed out. Did they pass out? Well, they passed out because enough oxygenated blood wasn't getting to the brain. Now, were they doing that because the carotid arteries were squeezed shut, or were they doing that because the vagus nerve caused a cardiac arrest?
Right.
And in that moment, you simply can't know. It's one of the reasons why breath play is pretty much universally banned at play parties.
Yes.
Because it can go so wrong
Yeah.
so quickly. It's basically, there's nothing a dungeon monitor could really do to intervene to
Right.
change the outcome.
Yeah, exactly. So what other kinds of play would you consider, dangerous at best?
There are 5 practices that, as an expert witness, I would have a very hard time defending to a jury.
Right.
Can I make up some statistics?
Sure, you can make up anything you like. We don't care.
Okay.
The facts are completely irrelevant.
Well, okay, again, I'm making up some statistics here. 90% of all BDSM activity, if it goes as wrong as it could plausibly go wrong, how wrong is that going to be, really? I mean, unless things get completely insane, how bad is a spanking scene going to be? How bad is a clamp scene going to be?
There you go.
In legalese, there's no inherent risk of death or great bodily injury.
Right.
Okay, that leaves 10% of what we do,
Sure.
where there is inherent risk of death or great bodily injury. And in this, I would put things like suspension bondage, fire play, knife play, breath play, electrical play, and so forth.
Gee,
Now, for
3 of the things I love to do.
now 4/5 of them there are reasonable precautions you can take to mitigate the risk down. Breath play, electrical play, knife play, suspension bondage can all be done in reasonable safety by properly trained people using the proper equipment in the proper way.
That's true.
Now that leaves about 2% of what we do where there's inherent risk of death or great bodily injury, and there are no meaningful risk mitigation practices.
Yeah.
And basically, you're betting on luck.
Yeah, there's always the unexpected. Something can always go wrong, or you could just slip and...
And I put 5 practices in this category. Any form of breath play.
Right.
Okay. Any play involving an actual firearm. I mean, I posted in my FetLife group recently about a gunplay death down in Florida.
Right.
Any play that involves sudden punching-like impact to the anterior chest. That can cause a situation called commotio cordis, which is a sudden cardiac arrest secondary to a blow to the chest. For example, it's the #1 killer in Little League games.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Yeah, some kid takes a baseball or softball to the chest. And it's a timing issue. There's a very short interval in each heartbeat, and if a hard blow to the chest is struck during that interval, it can cause a cardiac arrest. We know that sudden severe pain can cause a vagus nerve-mediated cardiac arrest, and particularly sudden severe pain to the cervix in women or the testicles in men can cause this. There are guys who get kicked in the balls, and they're in cardiac arrest before they hit the floor. I've actually got a case report out of Singapore, of all places, of a man and a woman who got into a fight over a parking space, and she grabbed him by the testicles and squeezed his testicles so hard that he went into cardiac arrest.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and there's actually pictures of the Singapore paramedics trying to defibrillate the man and so forth, and she ended up going to prison behind that.
Oh, my.
And it's for that reason that a growing number of places are no longer allowing ball kicking as a plaything.
Well, that's a good thing.
You know, but the big one, the big dog, by far and away, the #1 killer of the BDSM activity that by far is the #1 cause of a scene ending with somebody dead is somebody being in highly restricted bondage and completely alone.
Right.
Now I define highly restricted bondage as bondage so restrictive that in the event of a fire or something like that, the bottom can't get themselves outside unassisted in no more than 1 minute.
Yeah.
So they're hog-tied, or they're tied to a chair or a post or something like that.
Yeah, you can never leave your sub, ever.
Well, when I teach my bondage classes, I talk about degrees of monitoring, and I describe tight monitoring, where you're right there in the room with them.
Yeah.
Loose monitoring, which is how you might monitor a sleeping child left in your care. For example, maybe you're not in the room,
Sure.
but you can hear them if they yell for help. And restrained patients in hospitals are visually assessed every 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And then there are completely unmonitored bondage situations. And in my opinion, there are some practices that are acceptably safe only in close monitoring, like a gagged bottom.
Right.
Okay. There are some practices that are acceptably safe in loose monitoring, and there are a few practices that are acceptably safe in completely unmonitored situation. But like in my FetLife group, I've got, as we have stickies on FetLife.
Yes.
I've got 5 stickies in my FetLife group of scenes with a fatal outcome. All 5 are bondage, highly restricted bondage and completely alone
Right.
scenes. If the only thing we ever taught people about BDSM was if you tie them up, then stay with them.
Yes, exactly.
Uh,
I like to use quick releases, like either carabiners or the little clips, so that the sub can always get out if they need to. Yeah, I rarely will tie somebody up and not have it so they can't get out on their own if they want to.
Yeah, I think a good question is, for a top is, would you trust this person to take care of a sleeping infant? I mean,
Right.
you know, some people have, for example, some people have seizure disorders.
Yes. Yes.
And so I think, you know, how much bondage should they do with their partner? Because you would have to ask yourself, what if I have a seizure while my partner is bound?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so possibly have at least some means of escape or something like that.
Yeah, and it applies to more than just being bound too, because medical issues will certainly affect if you're doing electrical play. So yeah, you really have to know what a person's health issues are before you ever play with them, and then only do what you can accordingly. So
medical issues are one of the items on my checklist, by the way.
yes, well, it's certainly on one of mine since I love doing electrical play.
Okay.
So I would never ever touch anybody with any electrical device without knowing if they have, brainwave issues, if they have seizure issues, heart issues, implanted devices, all of that kind of stuff.
Now, there's a book out there called Juice, Electricity for Pain and Pleasure, written by my friend Uncle Abdul, who is in fact an electrical engineer.
Well, and so am I.
Oh, well, that's right. All right.
Yes, exactly. And in fact, I worked in the medical electronics industry for about 5 years.
Okay.
Which is where I learned not to use any kind of devices that actually allow current to flow through your body. Because current doesn't necessarily flow in a straight line through your skin or through your
path
tissue.
Of least resistance.
It does take the path of least resistance, and you can have point A and point B, and it can go way up there before coming back down to that thing that's only 2 inches apart. So you have to be very careful. That's why I won't use a TENS unit.
Interesting.
For only that reason.
Interesting.
And while they're safe and you can get them at any CVS for $30-$40, it's just one thing I won't do.
Okay.
Yeah, it's weird. Anyway, sorry. I interrupted.
Not at all.
So let's see here. What else can we talk about here? Boy. So, okay, yeah, like future stuff, future projects, books. I know you've been talking lately about I don't know if it's going to be a foundation or what are you going to call your little, what was the acronym, the PIN or, I forgot.
Okay, a couple of things. I'm seriously considering doing a book on first aid law. Because I'm on a Google group right now for people who teach first aid and CPR classes and EMT classes. And I am a former law school professor. And I'm always...
Professor?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Well, this is a new one to add to the list. Okay.
But I'm always clarifying, like, the Good Samaritan law and when there is and is not a legal duty to provide emergency care to someone.
Right.
And stuff like that. I'm going to be doing a book on BDSM and non-monogamous relationships. Working title is Multiple Collars.
Okay.
And yes, I'm in the process of starting a nonprofit corporation to make long-term loans to people in the BDSM community who have fallen on hard times. We're going to call it PIN money, which is unofficially going to stand for Perverts in Need.
Right.
And so, yeah, we're looking at launching the nonprofit in the spring of 2016.
Yeah, well, really cool. That's going to be, it'll be nice to see. Because we obviously know people that are in need.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about? Cover-wise?
Whatever pleases you, man.
Oh my God! I have a new sub.
We'd have to negotiate.
Yeah, we'd have to negotiate. Boy, well, that could take forever with your list of 16 categories.
Actually, what I have found about that is that if I'm highly compatible with someone, I can run down that checklist in about 15 to 20 minutes, and generally it's a very pleasant conversation. On the other hand, if it takes me more than an hour to get through that checklist,
Yeah, there's probably something wrong.
it's a concern.
Yeah.
It's a concern.
I would agree with that. Okay, well, let's see here. We've sort of hit an hour here. I think this would probably be a reasonable ending point here. Do you have any other books, and do you have your tapes and stuff that you, your videos?
Yes.
Can we plug everything?
Well, I've got 2 bondage videos I've done. Jay Wiseman, Erotic Bondage for Beginners,
Right.
and what's called Tight Immobilizing Bondage. And you go to jaywiseman.com, you can find out more info on those.
Where's the best place to buy these things?
At this point, get a hold of me either through my website or through FetLife, or I'm on Facebook. So I can be contacted through Facebook.
Right. By the way, people, FetLife.com is a great place to go for meeting all varieties and fetishes and groups and events in your area. I highly recommend that you go on, you get yourself sign in, get an account. You don't have to fill out a bunch of information to get started, but it is a great way to find resources. And of course, friend Jay, and
Please.
join his group.
It's called
Group name again was?
Jay Wiseman's FetLife Group.
Gee, how convenient.
There you go. Easy to remember.
Exactly. And I know you can find the book on Amazon, so SM101. I don't know if your other stuff is on there, but
most of I've got 6 books currently in print.
Oh, wow.
And they're widely available. You can get them on Amazon. You can get them in brick and mortar stores.
yes, in fact, I even bought yours at the local Good Vibrations.
Okay, yes, Good Vibrations. We've been doing business with them for many, many years. They're great. Actually, the woman who was my primary partner at the time, Janet Hardy, she wrote a book called The Sexually Dominant Woman. And back when we were first starting out, I was delivering a bunch of those books to Good Vibrations in San Francisco, and it was a very hot summer day. And I managed to finally stagger into the store carrying this box of books, and I told the nice lady behind the counter, would you please tell them in the back that Jay Wiseman just walked in with 30 sexually dominant women, and boy, is he ever tired.
Dear. Okay, so let's see here. I also want to give a quick plug out to Domina, my friend who owns frugaldom.com. That's FRUGALDOMME.com. She makes great toys. They manufacture their own stuff, plus they bring in stuff from other people that make it. It's really great place to get really good, cost-effective toys. And they're wonderful. She does custom work as well, which I have a number of her vloggers. So please go there and buy stuff. And let's see here, what else? Of course, for replays, you can see it here for at least 24 hours, and everything else you can find on catch.me/MistressChristmasXMAS. And I think that pretty much covers it. So thank you all for coming, and we are out of here.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, and hopefully Jay will come back again, and we'll do more of these as we go along. So,
As pleased as you, ma'am.
oh my God, we're going to have a play session.